Hello, I'm speaking to you this evening from the capital in Bendigo, and I'd like to acknowledge the Dja Wurrung on whose land we are and pay respects to the elders past, present and future. It's terrific to be here with you and thank you for joining us. My name is Rosemary Sorensen and I'm the director of Bendigo Writers Festival. Bendigo Writers Festival is managed by BV&E, that's the big letters you can see behind you, behind me, and that's a unit of the City of Greater Bendigo, and we'd like to thank them for their support yet again for hosting this event. Thanks to Text Publishing, who published the book that we're celebrating tonight, Sold Down the River, by Scott Hamilton and Stuart Kells. They've worked with us to bring this event to you online, and we're very grateful to them for that. The book is available in Bendigo from Dimmicks Bendigo, and they've received a pile of signed copies in time for the launch. So if you're in Bendigo, you can drop in and pick up a signed copy of Sold Down the River, or you can phone them or go on their Facebook and they'll send one out to you. So to our speakers for this evening. The writers of the book Sold Down the River, Scott Hamilton and Stuart Kells. Scott Hamilton is an expert in natural resource management and climate change. He is a member of the Energy Transition Hub at the University of Melbourne. Stuart Kells, well known to Bendigo audiences, he's an adjunct professor at La Trobe University in the business school there, and he's a writer of a dazzling array of books, including Shakespeare's Library, The Convent, Penguin and the Lane Brothers, Argyll, extraordinary range of books from Stuart Kells. Scott and Stuart will be speaking tonight with Tim Flannery, a scientist, environmentalist, conservationist, a writer whose work matters so much because it helps us feel less confused and more knowledgeable. That makes him perfect for introducing to talk about Sold Down the River, because I don't think there's a topic more important for demystifying right now than water trading, water rights, and our in danger river system. We're delighted to be hosting three such terrific writers and would like to thank you, our online audience, for being with us, because you are going to be the energy behind the conversation that's had tonight. We will record this conversation and it will be available for our Bendigo Writers, through our Bendigo Writers Festival YouTube channel, and please do share it and make it available to people that you might know. Our mission at the Bendigo Writers Festival, as a regional writers festival, is to reach out, to connect with people and to do our bit to strengthen the conversations around important topics, to stop complacency, to make it more accessible for people to be part of the national conversation. So we want to keep up that joyful energy, and to have these people with us here to speak about such an important book is a real pleasure. If you'd like to comment or put a question, you'll see that the Q&A is open. You'll see that the live chat isn't, but the Q&A is available to you, and I'll be able to monitor those questions, and we'll pass them on to Tim and Scott and Stuart a little later in the event. It's my very great pleasure now to welcome the authors, Scott and Stuart, who I hope will appear on screen in a moment, and to invite Tim Flannery to introduce our conversation for this evening about Sold Down the River, this very important and terrific book. Over to you, Tim Flannery. They'll come up. There we go. There's Scott Hamilton. There's Tim Flannery. And when Stuart finds the button, here he comes. Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Great. Look, thank you so much. Could I begin by just saying an enormous congratulations, Scott and Stuart, on an incredible and very timely and extremely important book. I can't even pretend to understand the full complexity of it, but I hope this evening to start moving in to some of that. And I should just say I'm calling in from the banks of the, from Darug country on the banks of the Hawkesbury River, where we've never had water trading, thank Christ, I say, because it sounds like a nightmare to me. Now, here's the book. The first point I'd like to make about it, and this is a question to either of you can answer. I noticed that the river, that bluish arrow on the cover, flows from bottom left to sort of top right. And if I look at a map of the Murray-Darling Basin, it kind of looks like it's flowing backwards on the cover. Was there a subtle message there for us, or what's going on?
Very good question. I'll have an attempt. Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, everyone. It's great to be here and great to be talking to you about something that's so important. Tim, as you well know, the people at Text are responsible for design, and we just do what they tell us, is the first part of the answer. Another part of the answer is that there's been this really strange process of financializing water, turning it into a financial product and a tradable financial product, which obviously we'll talk a bit more about. One of the things that people thought when water was separated from land was that the rights would flow upriver to where the yields are more certain or higher, where the soils are better, where there's more infrastructure. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the opposite has happened. And that's one of the perverse consequences of the this massive natural resource management experiment. So yeah, there's a few things going on in that picture. Okay, well, I must say, you know, when John and I went down the Murray-Darling River system when we filmed Two Men in a Tinny, the one thing I noticed is the water might have been going downstream, but the wealth was going upstream. We noticed that at Burrawarrina, largely Aboriginal community on the Darling in Western New South Wales, their kangaroo abattoir, which was the only major employer in town really, was closed. And have a guess where it was going to open? St George in Queensland, centre of the cotton country. I don't know how that happened, but it was just one example of wealth flowing upstream, I thought.
The other comment just on the cover of the book, Tim, and thank you very much for doing this tonight. We're very grateful of you taking your time and supporting the book. Is that I'd just like to acknowledge the designer Jessica Horrocks from Text, who did that terrific design of the cover. And I think that my daughter said to me that the arrow is probably going up, so it takes the eye to our names rather than away from the important parts of the book.
Well, it's possible. But anyway, it's a very striking cover, that's for sure. And I think there's a secret message in there somewhere. But look, could I just go to the basics? As I read your book, I found myself by turns sort of flummoxed and enraged, confused. And there was just a few, I find it difficult to really comprehend how this system evolved. So could you just tell me, I mean, I guess if I buy shares in a company, I can go to a share registry somewhere, can't I, and see who else owns the shares and how they've traded over time and who's bought them and who's sold them and so forth. It seems to me that with water trading, you can't do that. So why is my first question? Why is this secret information when it should be public quite clearly?
Stuart, do you want to? I'll overgo and then you can follow, Stuart, if that sort of works. Well, it's a Byzantine or it's a priesthood, we would say, Tim, and it's actually very confusing and very hard to see what is really going on. And that's really one of the major design faults, we think, of the actual market, that there's not good governance, there's not good integrity, and there's not good transparency with what is going on. And that allows the, as we say in the book, the smart asses in the boiler rooms to really take advantage of the system. So it's not a level playing field. And some people have got a lot of knowledge about what is going on, both in terms of the climate as well as the various water markets across the basin, as well as what the farmers are likely to be doing, all those things. And the others are sitting on their laptop in their kitchen table, trying, like most family farms especially, trying to work out what is going on. So we think you're exactly right, that we need to have a lot more transparency. It's only recently that in the state of Victoria that we've started to identify the major water users. And we actually found out that the biggest water use, the biggest water holder in the state of Victoria is a Canadian pension fund that used a $1 company as a front, or as the way of getting into the market. We're pleased that there'll be some further measures coming in very soon in this state to actually make it even more transparent. But certainly we've got a long way to go.
Yes, I'd say so. Stuart, do you have anything to add there?
Well, it goes back to that.
Before you do, can I just to make sure that people understand, could I just quote from the Australian government website about our water market? Because it's, before you go on slagging this blooming magnificent creation of the federal government, I think we need to hear the facts from the federal government. And it says here, the Australian water market is recognised globally as a water reform success story. It allows for the best use of scarce water resources. It encourages efficient water use by allowing it to flow to where it's most needed. And the market's grown rapidly as a result. I mean, is this true, Stuart?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Tim. And one of the reasons why we started this research was we had people in the regions all across the basin reach out to us. And we found that there was a real sense that people felt that they'd been lied to and that they'd been ripped off in this market. And so we did our research and we spoke to people and we looked hard at all sorts of different elements, which we can talk about. And what we found was that the people had been lied to and they'd been ripped off. So we confirmed that very much. So there's a whole bunch of different things in those claims that are false. The idea that the water market being efficient, it's not in any sense efficient. It's not efficient in the sense of how the market functions as just a platform. It's not efficient in terms of the allocation of water. The water's not going to its highest and best uses. And it's not efficient in the sense that the prices are a reliable indicator of value. Most of the prices that you see are in some sense an artifact of dominance of the market by a small number of hedge funds, essentially. So most, if not all of the claims that you just read are patently false. So going back to your question around the sort of what is this for and how does it work? It's not just a question of water going, value and economic activity going upstream. Value and economic activity are actually leaving the basin. The way that the market's been set up, it's essentially a drain of wealth from agriculture and from regional communities. At least hundreds of millions of dollars every year in hard cash is just flowing out of the basin purely through trading in the market. Now, the idea, the people who wrote the words that you read there, this is a beautiful market in theory, and it works very, very well in theory. The problem is that it's been working well in theory for more than a decade and not working at all in practice for a whole bunch of different reasons that we can go into.
Yes, well, look, I don't know what to say, Stuart. I mean, this is our federal government here. This is their official website.
Well, it wasn't just the federal government
website.
And it's not
it wasn't just the federal government.
Anyway,
other governments.
We'll leave that where it is because it's
see as well, I think. Sorry, go.
Well, yeah, well, I read a story in the paper today about inside trading, someone who stole $7 million with inside trading. They were caught up with and have been jailed for a number of years. How would you catch a water trader who was doing something like that? Who's the policeman? Who's the watchdog? Mr. Plod on the beat. He's going around trying to find out where this blooming stuff's going on. How do we go about catching the miscreants?
Well, but even before that question, Tim, right? So that question presupposes that insider trading in water is illegal. Now, something that will shock you and probably shock a lot of people listening is that we've set the water market up as essentially a financial market where you can trade futures and all sorts of different kinds of contracts, and you have banks doing, you know, up to the second trading. It's for all intents and purposes a financial market, but through a direct act of government, we have exempted the water market from all of the requirements under the ASIC Act and the Corporations Law that require good conduct in a financial market, and also that require certain things like central settlement and central information. So all sorts of things that would be explicitly banned in the stock market, futures market, energy trading, all sorts of other spheres are explicitly allowed in water. So it's not just a question of the fact that you've got these sort of aggressive traders in there doing what they do in other financial markets. They're actually going a lot further in water. So if someone's, for example, a hedge fund, and they've got a cozy relationship with an agribusiness, which gives them all sorts of useful inside information. They've got a cozy relationship with a water broker who's working both sides of all sorts of deals. That would be extremely illegal and improper in other contexts. It's routine in this context. And it's actually the basis for some pretty major profits and some pretty major basin-wide strategies.
So the people that set this up, were they Albanian shepherds or something, or perhaps, you know, our friends from Italy, from Sicily? I mean, why is it done this way? Presumably this was done by honest public servants and people who understood a little bit about markets and so forth. They couldn't have all hated farmers, could they, Stuart? What's going on?
You go first and I'll follow on that one.
Sure. Well, look, I think that part of it, Tim, was that everyone got sort of caught up in that late 90s and that 80s era of sort of Thatcherism and Reaganism, where markets were the answer to everything. So we wanted small governments and we wanted free markets and no regulation, because market, the invisible hand of Adam Smith was going to make the right choices for everybody. So everyone got on drinking this Kool-Aid. And that was sort of the view right through the politicians, through the public servants, and through the academia a lot. So the answer was, let's cap the amount of water, let's have some trading, and we'll be able to deal with this problem that we've got. But even Adam Smith would say that you've still got to have integrity, you've got to have a fair playing field, you've got to make sure there's good rules, there's good governance, there's a decent watchdog, but none of those things were there. And so I think that they might have hoped that the market would work in a certain way, which is what we sort of talk about, that it would mean that probably water would flow to its best use. And this is sort of above the choke and those more fertile areas of the system in terms of irrigation. But it went to where the money was, and that increasingly happened. And as a result, we've got these massive now. You talked about the sort of various uses up the Darling. Well, the other uses change that's happened over the last sort of 10 years or 5 years is the massive growth in these almond farms. So over the past sort of 15 years, there's been something like 1,500% growth since 2000 in these almond farms, which are permanent plantings that take a lot of water a lot of the time. And that's not really going to be a sustainable way for the system to work going forward. But that's the way the market sort of drove.
Yeah, look, if we could just go back to Adam Smith's invisible hand. I mean, you know, he died in the early 19th century. The invisible hand's probably not that active, but nevertheless, you know, when you read The Wealth of Nations, what he does talk about a lot is the impact of economic structures upon people. So, you know, his famous example of the pin factory, where he talks about making pins and how incredibly efficient it is if you give someone just one job, stick the head on the pin, make a point on the pin, blah, blah. You know, but he said, if you want to see a really dull person who's like got no life, it's a bloke who sticks heads on pins all day, 18 hours a day. So we've got to do something to give him a bit of interest in life, make life a bit better for him. Maybe he could, you know, join a militia or something, I think was Adam Smith's suggestion. But so, you know, we've lost that somehow. So the people who called upon the ghost of Adam Smith in the 1990s. First of all, they didn't know what they were talking about. And secondly, they entirely perverted, it seems to me, what Adam Smith was talking about.
Mm.
And look, we'll get back to the choke and these other questions later, but maybe because we're dealing with moral philosophy at the moment, we should just go into a couple of key questions. And, you know, what is water? Is water purely about financial returns, or is water life? If you were to ask an Aboriginal community from Nabaka up on the Darling, or you know, other people, they probably have the view that water's more than just money. So have we just taken a wrong turn at the very beginning?
I think I think the short answer is yes, and that's part of the problem, Tim, with especially when we put climate change in there as well. So we've got less and less of this most precious resource that's the essence of life, as you were saying, and we've got greater and greater demands and more people wanting to use and share it. And it's clearly not in terms of the First Nations, and we actually go into this quite a lot in the book as an important part of the story that needs to be told, is that there's clearly not the same access and ability for First Nations and mobs to deal in this water market the way that, again, these sort of high-speed traders, boiler rooms, people that have got no connection to the land and no real wanting to make a better place at all, and just really focus on the money. So yeah, I think there's a fundamental problem there.
I mean, what I've seen, you know, Scott, is you go out to Menindee and, you know, when there's no water in the river, the crime rate goes up in town because all the young kids are bored shitless. There's nothing to do. If there's water, they can go down the river and play and fish and whatever. But surely we must have an obligation there to our First Nations people and others to try to create a system of water use that recognises the fact they live there. That river is life to them, and that we somehow have to factor that in. Is there any effort to do that? I mean, has this water market got anything? Has it got a redeeming feature that might allow that to happen?
Look, I'll let Stuart have a crack at this, but I think one of the things that we do say, Tim, is that this idea of this speed and this multi-valley trading and all that sort of thing is really working to the advantage of the traders, not the communities and not the First Nations and other groups. So we need to slow it down as one of the things we talk about. Now, there's probably still a role for some sort of trading of water, particularly within a valley and that sort of area. And they used to trade water over a slab of beer at one stage, which is probably not a bad thing. But we also think there needs to be much better planning about what are the outcomes we're trying to get and how we're going to share this important resource. And we talk about things like citizens' assemblies and those sorts of ideas, which we think would be a much better way to make these important decisions.
Heavens forfend, a citizens' assembly, by God, you'd get a very different outcome, wouldn't you? I mean,
I suspect you might.
What? I think you're talking kind of, I don't know what it is, but it's a direct threat to the status quo there, Scott. I wouldn't. I'd be careful of your back.
Well, we've certainly had a few views put forward to us.
Yeah, part of that conversation is around values and the notion of water and value. And it's certainly the case that the current system doesn't reflect all the different values associated with water. And in fact, it creates harm, for example, with respect to the environment through unseasonal flows and all sorts of different kinds of things like cold water pollution. So thinking of the river system as a water transfer system rather than as an ecosystem is part of the problem. But there's a whole bunch of other values that aren't properly reflected in the market. And another quick comment about values. This is a good way for people who are listening to be able to tell whether someone knows what they're talking about when they talk about water. But we hear from people in the market a lot, some of the traders and some of the market operators, who talk about how the price of water entitlements has gone up to something like $8,000 a megalitre and that kind of thing. And they look across to the US and they say, oh, well, it's actually $26,000 a megalitre in Colorado. So there's a lot of room for it to run in Australia. And that is just the largest piece of nonsense. that I could imagine for a whole bunch of reasons. As you very well know, Tim, the value of water is entirely contextual. It's about what you can do with it on the soil. It's what you can do with it in terms of transport. It's what you can do with it in terms of legal rights. It's what you can do with it in terms of security and flows. All of those things are fundamentally different across different countries. So the idea that you can compare the value of American water to Australian water and then reach some sort of useful conclusion is just nonsense. And it just shows how that kind of concept of water as a commodity has gone to an extreme end.
Scott, we've only got 10 minutes left, and Stuart, sorry, as well. I just wanted to explore 3 areas here which go directly to what you're saying, Stuart. You know, reading your book, it seemed to me that the water traders had developed some derivative product of quantum physics with a double slit experiment that allowed water to go instantaneously from one river system into the other. Is that the case? I mean, how do you trade between water catchments? How does the water go from one water catchment to the other? Or am I just missing a point here?
Well, the trading in the water rights is connected to actual flows. They happen separately, but ultimately the ownership of the rights does direct where the water goes. There's all sorts of anomalies.
But does it go uphill, Stuart? It's going to go up into the other catchment. How does that work?
Well, there have been stories of people taking so much water from parts of the Darling, for example, that for a time the river has flowed backwards.
Perhaps that's the answer.
That is possible. But if you think about it, because most of the water comes from the top of the catchment, it's possible to deliver water pretty much anywhere. So there's a lot of netting and things that happen. But yeah, the question of sort of how do water rights sort of differ from flows? Well, there's all sorts of very, very complicated rules around inter-valley transfers and transferring water through the Barmah choke. Most of those rules were set up for irrigation and hydrological reasons. And there's all sorts of different sort of tweaks on rights, things like carryover and grandfathering and tagging of rights. All of these things had their origins in use of water for farming, which was kind of radical, and irrigation. But all of them have turned into wrinkles and tweaks and anomalies that the traders and the hedge funds use as much as possible to drive profit. So they do all sorts of clever things. There's queuing that happens with these inter-valley transfer rights, and they use complicated computer algorithms to be first in the queue. They have these billionth of a second computer programs, which means that they dominate all of the queuing. And they move rights between these valley choke points for arbitrage purposes. Essentially, if the water is cheaper at one point, they can use their market dominance to move water around to exploit these price differences. So trades like that and trades that are relating to some of those mega farm investments that Scott touched on, they're the sorts of things that are happening across the basin that are driving profits, and they're ultimately affecting the flow of water, and they're affecting the profile of agriculture for reasons in the water market. Nothing really to do with reasons in agriculture or the economics of farming. So that is the essence of the failure that we've really sort of rounded on.
Well, Stuart, just so I can get my head around this, I want to put a practical proposition to you on this, right? So there I am at Tom Grogan, head of the Murray, last farm up the Murray, and I've got a megalitre worth of water I want to sell to someone down in Morgan in South Australia, right? So it's going to flow down there. There'll be some evaporation. There'll be some loss through the soils. There'll be salinity probably added to that water. Is the bloke down the bottom really getting his megalitres worth? And if he isn't, where does the rest come from?
Well, one of the key anomalies that we've really tried to highlight in this book, Tim, is that there's a whole series of what effectively are subsidies between the top and the bottom of the system. So that megalitre that goes down, the price of that megalitre is subsidised in 3 or 4 really important ways. It's subsidised in terms of the hydrology, because all the water losses along the way aren't adequately reflected in the price that the downstream purchaser pays. It's subsidised in an environmental sense, because the environmental harm through bank erosion and other damage along the way is not taken into account. And it's subsidised in a capital market sense as well, because often down the bottom end, you've got these mega farms that have different access to capital, different ability to borrow compared to family farms and traditional farms. So the short answer is that the market doesn't, and the pricing doesn't adequately reflect all of those costs and all of those impacts along the way. And that's another reason why this system is driving water in the wrong direction.
But Stuart, the price is one thing, but the water is the other. So I've got a megalitre, I release it, maybe half of it's lost to evaporation and to soaking into the soil and so forth. The bloke at the other end's only getting 500 litres. He might only get 750 mils. Drown his sorrows with that. I don't know. But like, where does the rest of the water come from that the bloke's purchased? Is that just coming out of a general pool or what?
Well, he gets his megalitre, but it's really at the expense of the system, and it's at the expense of the global system.
So the environment is what you're talking about here. Is that right?
In large part, that's right.
So and just to get me right on this, Stuart, am I correct in saying that this water market has been conceived and executed without any respect or any due diligence being paid to climate change and increasing evaporation rates and so forth? Is this right?
Well, I think I'll hand to Scott on that, but I think the short answer is that climate change wasn't very strongly reflected in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan for a whole bunch of not very edifying political reasons, nothing to do really with environmental science or with public policy. So yes, it is true that this system we have really under reflects and does not properly cater for the impact of climate change.
Right. So what you're saying then is that the amount of water that the environment has to expend to subsidise each water trade is increasing by the year as climate change extracts more water out of the system. Am I right there, Scott, or not?
Yeah, look, yes, you are, but it's actually worse than that, I think, Tim. Would be the,
oh, God, would have to be.
With the sort of, I think, so a couple of sort of important, sort of fundamental sort of things to get our head around when we start to talk about this. One is that when the states and the federal government developed the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and came up with the magical number of 2,750, which was a figure that was a political fix, was really not, it wasn't part of the science of what was needed for various outcomes. So that was the first sort of thing we need to sort of get our head into, that the Murray-Darling Plan wasn't based on a scientific evidence base there. It was a political fix. And it didn't include climate change because, and that's partly because at that time was the time of Tony Abbott, if you remember, and the carbon tax. And so suddenly climate change was such a negative topic for the Gillard government at this stage that they just didn't go there. And so that was an important part of it. So we're in a situation where we've got this cap, which we're trying to deliver water for the environment, and it's getting smaller. Now remember that the environment groups as well as the irrigators bought into this idea of the cap and trade at one stage. So a lot of both sides were sort of party to it, but they've both lost, is what we would say. It's both the irrigators as well as the farmers. So the brown plus the green both lost. The people that won are the money makers. And I think that the important sort of thing to think about is that the advantage of these traders that have got no connection to the land, no connection to the water, just want to make money, are basically competing against another side of the trade, which might be the irrigators or the farmers. Now, the farmers, for example, or the other water users, have got all these other costs. They've got the capital costs, they've got their planting costs, they've got their labour costs, etc., etc. And they're limited when they can trade in those sorts of things. So what we've sort of identified is the boiler room traders can push those other users or those communities and those farmers to their maximum willingness to pay every time. So as we would say, there's nothing left on the table, which means
we've only got
it's unfair and they can do that. Sorry? Yes.
So we've only got 3 minutes left and I'm desperate to come to solutions, Scott. We need some solutions. We can't just leave this in the terrible state it is. So here's my solution. We get an old steamer, one of those old paddle steamers. We put 3 lots of stocks on it. And, whoever goes into those stocks has to be naked. They have to have their bottom exposed. And as we go down the river, we find the largest carrot in Albury, in Bloomin' Machuca, in Tocumwal, wherever it is, and if the person who's had the roughest deal through water trading gets to insert that carrot wherever they want upon the person in the stocks. So the question I ask you, Scott and Stuart, is who goes in the stocks? Who is the person to blame for this? Now, don't be shy. Just jump in and tell us.
I'm trying to purge that mental before I speak, and I think it's affected my ability to speak. So, in one sense, governments can get a little bit off the hook because they kind of assumed that other people knew what they were doing. They assumed that the market designers knew what they were doing, and they assumed the regulators knew what they're doing, and they don't. So that's the best thing you can say to sort of absolve the governments. And in terms of the bankers and the hedge funds, well, they're doing what they do. They're doing here exactly what they do in energy and exactly what they do in the over-the-counter derivatives market. And it's in their nature, and they've got all their computers set up, and it's what they do. And so it's really our fault as a community that we let this happen, and that we kind of looked the other way because it was a bit complex, or we assumed someone else was doing it, or there was some magical thinking in policy circles. So unfortunately, Tim, I think it's going to be us. We're the ones that are responsible. So
we'll be in the stocks, Stuart. It doesn't seem that's very consistent with the entire story. We've got to be able to do better than that.
Well, we're already in the stocks, that's right. But yeah, part of the solution, I think, going back to your question around solutions, and Scott touched on this a little bit, the small first step would be to change the mode of trading and make it less about speed and being first in the market, and therefore remove a lot of the power imbalance between farmers and hedge funds. That would help a lot. I think we need to look again at this idea of letting hedge funds and banks in there as a source of liquidity. I think that was a mistake, and that the liquidity that they're providing is really of low quality anyway. We didn't need to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for low quality liquidity. And you talked about those sort of the websites saying how great farming is. Well, they talk about how it's awesome for farmers to be able to sell water in a drought and that kind of thing. If you read that sort of material, and from the ACCC as well, they talk a lot about willing sellers and willing buyers. If you walk around in the Murray-Darling Basin and use the phrase willing seller, and if there's any kind of whip or carrot around, then you're in serious trouble, because that's an absolute red rag in the basin, because they're not willing sellers, they're desperate sellers, and they're not willing buyers, they're often desperate buyers. And as Scott said, that happens in a way that the gains from trade generally go to the brokers, etc., and the traders. So slow everything down. Start thinking about those other values that we touched on: the environmental values, the Indigenous values, the community interests as well, and start reflecting those in how water is traded, etc. And then ultimately, to some extent, not in any sense trying to take away anyone's rights. And obviously, everyone needs to reflect what they've invested in if they're legitimate water owners, but ultimately moving away from a market mechanism in this space, because it was a failed experiment.
Oh, goodness gracious me! What a sorry story. I can take very little comfort in it, Stuart. All of that. It seems to me it's been a bloody catastrophe. And I know there's some people who are farmers, presumably from the basin, online tonight. I've been really trying to just give them a bit of levity, because I've put up with imbuggerance for obviously the last 20 or 30 years with this. And all I can say is I'm terribly sorry that our paddle steamer is going to have 3 empty sets of stocks on it, or the farmers are going to have to be there. We've got to be able to do better than that. We need a probe. Surely we need a probe to find out exactly who did what. But anyway, I think perhaps we should open it to questions.
Sure.
We need a probe. The probe is obviously the theme of the evening, with carrots and stocks and things.
Well, parsnips too. Queensland, we could use pineapples.
I love the way we joke about things, but I also know that it's an incredibly serious topic and an incredibly sad one. And I remember Stuart and Scott talking about the farmers standing with those fish You remember that image, which I think changed our minds momentarily, then we all looked away again. And I think that's why this book is so important, for it to pull and, you know, take some of those traders out to the river and see what's going on there. The first question that came in, let's just whiz through a few of these, was from Jonathan, to ask how much, was to bring up Barnaby Joyce's name as Minister for Water, and to ask maybe Scott, how much damage did Barnaby Joyce's role as Minister for Water do?
Well, certainly didn't help, Rosemary, would be my sort of first comment. And I think part of the fundamental problem has been, and we sort of go into this, is the politics of water is toxic like the politics of climate change. And it's actually a very similar story, especially for this country. It has been an absolute disaster, and it's continuing to be a disaster. And people such as the water ministers of Barnaby Joyce, but it's not just Barnaby, there's a whole litany of water ministers over the 20 years or so, which have really, I think, shirked their responsibility for taking this issue head on. And it is really serious. It won't be long until we face a drought similar to what we just saw. And we saw it and we're seeing it in California now. That will be us very soon, again. And I think it was an example the other day. There was a CSIRO study that was looking at the impacts of climate change on the system. And those big almond farms that I was talking about before use as much water in a year as what there is available in a drought year. So there's not going to be enough water for those farms as those trees grow and mature. So we'll be ripping those almond trees out like they are in California now.
Just
so it's really serious.
Just to add to that though, if you're working in farming and agriculture and you hear that fact that there's not going to be enough water for all the permanent plantings in a drought, that's a terrible piece of news, right? That sounds bad. But if you're a water trader and if you're a hedge fund, that's the best news you've heard in your life, because it means the prices are going to spike and you're going to have all these extra opportunities. And that's the difference between farmers and traders. Very, very quickly, the point around the fish and the mass fish kills at Menindee and other places, those Murray cod were what, Scott, 20, 30, 40 years old, 50 years old?
More than 40 years old, yeah.
So just think about that. These fish have survived all of the droughts in the last 40, 50 years. And so what's happening now isn't, or 2 years ago, wasn't a problem of drought. It's a problem of how the system's being managed.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Tim bringing up the morality behind this, and I guess this is the question about why does politics seem to remove and trading seem to remove morality, and that's a question, a huge philosophical question. I'm getting some comments from Josephine and from Rob about remembering people who worked on the land and worked with the river and understood water as a not a price, as a thing, something which was enabling and that they had to care for as well. And I know there's a lot of movement back into sustainability and the idea of using water in different ways. Did you two find, and maybe I'll start with Scott, did you find that that people were coming to you with stories about how to use water and farming? Because this is a story not just about water, it's about farming, isn't it? Did you find that, Scott, that there is some better use?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a lot that we can all learn, I think, Rosemary, and actually a lot that we can learn from our First Nations. I think it's really worthwhile sort of pointing that out. And we talked about the eel traps at Budge Bin, which are tens of thousands of years old, the Birrawa fish traps that Tim mentioned before, and those sorts of areas where clearly, again, those water systems and infrastructure survived tens of thousands of years, not just last 50 years. So there's a lot that we can learn from those First Nations. And again, I think that the farmers and the other water users that are seeing what's happening to our river systems have got lots of solutions with how we can use water better and make better choices with the diminishing resource we've got. And they are more than willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved the problem is, again, sort of this fundamental issue that people which are just chasing the money and not the outcomes for the system. And could I just make one other point? Sorry for going on, but our thinking actually developed over the few years that we've been working on this. So I actually wrote a piece a couple of years ago that said the first thing we think we should do is say that you must have a connection to the land and water in use. So not necessarily saying that water needs to be tied back to the land, but say there needs to be, you have to have a connection to water in use if you're going to play in this market. And that is a way to fix the system. Well, that is partially true, but the traders and the big multinational agribusinesses have sort of cottoned onto that. And they've realised there's actually lots of value in having that connection to the agribusinesses as well. So we have to get smarter, I think, is the point.
You know, Scott, maybe one thing we could do is if you had transparent figures as to who bought and sold water, you could make it an obligation that those who've made the hundreds of millions have to spend 6 weeks a year in a river town where the water's come from. Be a very pleasant 6 weeks for them, but we could, you know, something like that might bring a bit more transparency to the whole thing. Anyway.
So just quickly on that point around morality, Rosemary, so this idea of sort of traders pretending to be farmers, pretending to be large-scale irrigators, there's something fundamentally about lying and it's fundamentally immoral in that. And we heard traders bragging about how they could pretend to be doing you know, transactions that had an agricultural purpose, but really had just a market purpose. But there's something also immoral and a bit corrosive about the arbitrary transfers of wealth that that the trading is creating, where essentially farmers are losing a lot of money to fast traders. There's a cultural impact as well, where farmers are much more wary about talking about water and talking about what they own, because they feel, and often rightly, that people will use that information against them. And finally, in terms of morality, it's having a toxic and corrosive effect on basin politics, because there's so much money to be made, nothing to do with agriculture, just to do with playing the rules, playing the system. And people who make that money are very protective of it. And so there's a lot of you know, dissimulation and a lot of lying and a lot of you know, vested interests that are really a product of how this market has been misdesigned.
You three will understand what I'm about to say. I think there's been a lot of mistrust and from city people who always think, oh, farmers are just in it for money, you know. And now you're showing us another side of this, which is, and in your book you describe the anger and people saying to you, they're not going to listen to us, and then you realise that people haven't been listening to them. Tim got in a tinny and went down the river. You two got in a car and probably drove through Bendigo and headed off, and I must have been lots of terrific trips. There's a romantic side to this. Can we maybe garner that and get Australians to understand, when you go the Murray, darling, I mean, it's, you know, it's wonderful, even for somebody who hasn't been in a tinny. Is there something in that we could shift? And I loved Tim's idea of 6 weeks on, you know, in a chuka. How do we get to listen to the people that you listen to? Scott?
Yeah, look, I think that, again, what's sort of, and it is not necessarily the answer, I think, Rosemary, but this idea of a citizens' assembly or some way of having a much broader conversation. We actually looked at whether we would be a good idea to have yet another Royal Commission. There's been so many Royal Commissions that we actually don't think that they've had the impact that they need to. We do think there's also a need for a probe that Tim was talking about, but it's more a ASIC probe, a follow the money, following what is actually really going on, because there was a limit to how much the MHCCC could do. But absolutely, and this again, it's not a green versus brown issue. It's not a left versus right issue, which you're rightly pointing out has been one of the, I think, fundamental shifts in this whole debate, but it is a power versus non-powerful parts of the system. And there's lots of users and communities that are being disenfranchised. And I think that the politicians largely just don't want to know because it's too hard. And so I think we really need to see a rise up of those people.
Yeah, definitely. Talking to the people, talking to the communities was such a privilege, and it's been a privilege for Scott and I to be able to do this work. One of the conversations that we run into all the time is the ACCC inquiry into water recently. And we know that there are a lot of people who didn't speak to the ACCC and a lot of questions that the ACCC didn't ask, including having access to some of the trading rooms and the modelers and the people who were designing platforms and designing hydrological models and trading environments, people we spoke to that they didn't speak to. But also there's just a lack of trust in some of these government agencies. And I'd also say that this market has evolved in a really strong way as a financial market, but the ACCC is not a financial market regulator. ASIC is a financial market regulator. And so a lot of the constructs and the tools and the expertise that the ACCC has brought to this aren't suitable, and they haven't applied an up-to-date understanding of financial market conduct, and they haven't applied an up-to-date understanding of the sorts of tactics and the sorts of behaviours that are driving trading profits.
Paul is asking about something really, and again, I was going to say technical, but it's really, none of this is really that hard if we just pay attention for a bit. But he's talking about a parliamentary inquiry into into the licensing of floodplain harvesting. Scott?
Which is very topical right at the moment, actually, which is an inquiry that's going on in New South Wales at the moment, which has, I think, really got to lift their game on transparency that Tim was talking about before, but also this idea of floodplain harvesting. So you remember we talked about the Murray-Darling Basin plan and having this cap and this magical number that sort of was a political fix. Well, part of the problem was, and is, which is what this inquiry is about, is that some of the floodplain harvesting doesn't actually get included in that cap. So not only are we poor at measuring and monitoring and knowing who owns that water, we also don't include it in this part of the system. So I think it's, again, just another example of epic fail in how we're going about this really important resource. The thing that worries me, and I sort of will just sort of be a bit doom focused for a minute, there is a fundamental problem, because this is a system that we're really turning on its head, particularly over the last couple of decades. And it's the same time which we are dealing with dangerous climate change. And this is also how we feed our people, also remember. So there's some real risks and challenges. And I don't think, like, it's been 6 months since that ACCC report that Stuart mentioned has been sitting on the Treasurer's desk. And no one's, it's like this topic's not being talked about in the general.
Could I just jump in there too, Scott? I mean, this is an absolutely urgent problem. The 2 driest years ever recorded for the Murray-Darling Basin and southeastern Australia were 2019, 2020. You know, where the impacts of climate change are very real right now. And, you know, we suffer from this European view of what a river is. It's just the water between the banks. That is absolute rubbish in Australia. The water that flows over land and gets into the river, the water that flows through the sands, all of the sediments around the river, all of that needs to be counted as a single unit. It's not separate from the river, the water that flows between the 2 banks. It's intimately interconnected. So this idea that you can just steal water by putting bunds up and stuff across the country and diverting it onto your land and stopping it getting downstream is bloody, in my view, it should be criminal. It's a terrible indictment of the way that we're acting, that's allowed. Anyway.
That's right. And look, I think there was some work that CSIRO did recently for the scientists we've still got left in CSIRO, which basically worked out that in the last 20 years, the inflows to the Murray-Darling Basin are half what they were for the past 100 years before that. And in the next 10 years, they're going to drop by a further 10% in terms of rainfall, but that means the flows drop by about another quarter. So this is really drastic stuff, and we're just not dealing with it.
Can we mobilise the people who live along the river?
I think that's part of it, and I think it's got to be. I agree, Rosemary, but I think it's also got to be the city people as well as the country. Like this is, I think the Murray-Darling Basin is so fundamental to the Australian psyche that everyone that's in Australia needs to be taking this seriously and demanding change, I think, is one of the comments you made. And
Stuart, you've said that, I'm sorry, no, I won't answer that question because I'll take you away, and I'd rather have people comment. Rob's been commenting a lot about high value farmers that are part of the problem, and water's moved around. He's referring to things that you've already talked about, and floodplain harvesting he's talked about as well, and the way it's vested in companies offshore. And somebody said that the main reason free trading of water was developed was to enable the environment and urban areas to purchase and hold water entitlements. And the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder is by far the largest water holder. Is that so? Scott?
Yes.
You're nodding.
Short answer is yes. And this gets back to a bit of how we got to where we are today. And I think we also go right back to Alfred Deakin, that basically warned Australia to not go down the path of America. That
didn't work, did it?
and it didn't work. We basically ignored that. And it was this idea that we cap the water and that we have the environmental water holder, and that would mean that we'd be able to ensure the environment was looked after. That was largely the theory. But a couple of fundamental problems was, one, well, whether that cap was right or not. That's not the critical part of the debate, we think. But the fact of having that cap meant that that was a hard edge. And as Stuart was saying, the traders love scarcity. Yes. And if you've got this hard edge, you can push up against that all the time. Right. And that means you can extract more and more money out of the users. The other thing that the environmental water holder doesn't address are other uses of water. So there's cultural flows issues, which are just not addressed as part of the environment. And there's real questions about the impacts of the trading is having on the environment in terms of what we sort of talk about, these high summer flows going through the choke, the Barmer choke, which is an important part of the whole system, and it's sort of like a pivot point for a lot of the trading in the market. Because we're artificially pushing water to where it's financially more valuable rather than necessarily where it's going to be the best outcomes for the community, economy, environment, and sort of social outcomes and cultural outcomes. Because we're artificially doing that, we're having all these perverse unintended consequences. So we've got 100-year-old trees falling into the river. We've got burial grounds, ancient burial grounds which haven't been moved because the bodies are rising up and those sorts of things. Like, it's tragic what's happening.
It is. That is, and I'm sorry to end to take you to that point, but very pleased to have spoken to you all. It is a horror story, but it's told with energy, and it's told with care, and it brings it to us in a way that is really not that difficult. I'm so tired of people thinking it's too hard, when what Stuart and Scott have done is to take the mystery out of the words that are used in water trading. And thanks so much to Tim Flannery for going down the river again in that tinny. I hope that that it still would float if you hopped in it. It would float. It's a terrific book. It would. And I'd like to see that again, actually. That was a lovely thing that you did, going down the river like that. And it's reminded me, by reading Soul Down the River, I'm reminded of that time. There's so many people who are caring about this river, and there's so many people who should. We will have this recorded, and it will be available. And please, I do remind you that Dimmicks in Bendigo have signed copies of this book, and I thoroughly recommend it. Thank you for all the comments about this conversation, and I look forward to seeing you all in Bendigo to talk some more about this down the river, down the track. Thank you to you all, and goodbye to our audience. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much.
And Tim.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Scott and Stuart, and everyone. It was great.
Good night.